Hey everybody, today on Catholic in America we'll be talking about the Lord of the Rings. All right, so we're talking about the Lord of the Rings today. So before we get into it, I know Father Tom Dillon, you are a Lord of the Rings super fan.
Nut.
I'm not quite super fan status. I think I'm serious fan status. You're
I'm probably more novice.
Yeah, not novice. I don't know. Noob, as the kids say.
Yeah. Years ago, I mean, maybe, I would have been more, but I don't know. Last 20 years, it hasn't hit me as much.
Tune into our Twitch channel where Father Tom Dillon plays Lord of the Rings video games.
They've had a good one a couple of years ago.
That's right.
I don't know if Twitch is still a thing, but if it is. So maybe we could just start with kind of where we first encountered Lord of the Rings and what were sort of some of those formative of moments for us. Obviously, if people don't know, J.R.R. Tolkien is the author and one of the most, I think, voted the most popular book of the 20th century in the English language, popular novel. Definitely, obviously there's been movies, there's been a TV show recently. We might want to get into that. I don't know if we want to.
We'll avoid that one.
But I guess for me, I first encountered Lord of the Rings. I read the books as a kid. I read The Hobbit as my older brother, I think, probably had a copy of it, and my brother Sean, and so I borrowed that. I still remember the first paperbacks of the actual books that had the covers kind of like have torn away or whatever.
That was like the terrifying Gollum and Bilbo in the front.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Mm-hmm. So that was my first experience. I can get into like when I first saw the preview for the movies later on. But
for me,
you were there when he first wrote it. Right?
Yeah, when I read it, I was actually
the 30s.
We actually I signed it for him. No, I'm a '70s kid, so I mean, as far as like growing up and all this, and so my brother was big time into, if I can say the word, Dungeons and Dragons, and so this book kind of flows into that a little bit. I mean, it has some of the very similar things in it. Orcs, goblins.
You're not a Protestant anymore. You can say Dungeons and Dragons.
I can say it all I want. Okay, good. Yeah. So anyway, reading this was, getting the opportunity to read this. I got my brother's copy after he was finished with it. And of course, same thing, kind of ripped apart. And but he had a couple of different versions of it as far as like the different books. So he had, the first one and the second one had different covers from different ways. So I guess read the same thing, but yeah. So I read them when I was younger. Read them again in high school, and it was just for me it was that excitement of the Dungeons and Dragons kind of a world coming into my world and getting to meet it. So yeah.
I think that my first one would have been like 4. When I saw the Rankin and Bass Hobbit cartoon. I think it was Rankin and Bass.
Oh,
the cartoon.
Yes, the Hobbit cartoon.
Yeah, I remember being like 5. I literally remember being like 4 years old and watching it and being absolutely freaking terrified. Absolutely terrified. But also like loving what I was seeing, especially because I remember like the songs and the orcs singing.
There's a lot of singing in it.
There's a lot of singing. I remember especially like the birds when they're up in the trees in the movie and the birds are coming down.
Never seen this.
Oh, dude, it was great. It was the best. It's great. If you want to like terrify like little children, show them that 1980s Hobbit cartoon. So I saw that first. Then I think I was 7 or 8 when I read the Hobbit book. And then I was going to the library and I picked up all the audiobooks and I think I listened to them about 400 times. So
nice. The actual audio of the trilogy.
I did the audio for the trilogy probably about 5. I read it as well, but then I listened to it when I was having to clean the house with my 6 sisters and my brother. So I just put on my cassette player at that time.
Cassette player.
Because it was cassettes. And then later it was DVDs. But I listened to that, and then
Turn the tape over. For side 2 or whatever.
Then I got Silmarillion when I was like 12, 13, and I also read that about 45 times probably.
45, that's it. Yeah. So to me, and maybe this is similar to y'all, like the Lord of the Rings, because for those that don't know, Tolkien was a very faithful Catholic, had a tremendous faith.
Son became a priest.
And his son became a priest, absolutely. He was adopted in a way by a priest after his mom had converted to Catholicism, and so they kind of lost a lot of their friends. So the Oratorians in England had a big influence on his life. But to me, like learning about the Lord of the Rings and beginning to read it kind of was always second to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia from C.S. Lewis, who was also a very famous Christian apologist in the Anglican Church, a convert from atheism. But a lot of people, and so that to me was always kind of the intro is you reading the Lord of the Rings and all those books of the Chronicles of Narnia, and then eventually get into the longer and more intensive and maybe less written for children, I guess, Lord of the Rings books. But I always find it interesting that Tolkien was one of the people that helped to convert C.S. Lewis to Christianity, and one of the people that he knew, one of the few Christians that he knew who were academics, because he was a linguist and had all sorts of kind of amazing academic pedigree. Tolkien did, so that was one of the kind of the linchpins for perhaps one of the most important apologists, explainers of the Christian faith of the 20th century was his friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yep. Yeah. No. I definitely with that. I think it was also important the influence of G.K. Chesterton.
Right.
Who was writing like 20 years before that. And so Chesterton, who kind of spawned that whole intellectual movement, Chesterton and Belloc, who were writing at the same time as you had H.G. Wells, and I think it was George Bernard Shaw, who were kind of the leading atheist writers who were writing and like publicizing and publishing their works and going back and forth tit for tat in the papers. So you definitely had kind of that intellectual movement in England, which spawned this burst of creativity in terms of creative writing. Like it started off academic, but like then you had, I remember there's one line from Lewis that I loved. It was, Lewis was criticized actually a lot for writing about theological matters and reading and putting theology and putting apologetics into his works. And Lewis had that one phrase, you might be familiar with it, but he said, when theologians start telling these stories and giving theology in a way that common people can understand, I'll stop writing my books. Because actually it was still these intellectual giants like Chesterton, Belloc, who spawned this. And then you have Lewis writing, you have then Tolkien, who's being influenced by these different thinkers. And then all of a sudden you have this burst of creativity, which really has captured the minds and imagination of not just children, but obviously even to this day, like has captured the minds of adults as like their stories still have this strange relevance now 50, 60 years later.
Well, and just the ability to write in these, using imagery and using, all these, creating worlds and creating even languages. Tolkien created languages for his children. What the bear used to write his children at Christmas time and tell them about all the things that he and Santa was doing up at the North Pole. And so you just had all this creativity from these, just extremely brilliant men. Just told you how brilliant they were, that they were able to put these into books and you're able to actually see it. I mean, if I started writing, things like that, somebody, they'd probably want to, commit me or something. So, it would not come across nearly as it wouldn't come across nearly as eloquent as what these men were able to do.
And I think that's an amazing maybe invitation as we're kind of talking about this. Obviously, we're all Catholic priests talking about the Lord of the Rings, that the need for people to be excellent in fiction. There's something about that within society that when we don't have that, when fiction is something that's banal or doesn't have something deeper beyond it, then it doesn't inspire. It doesn't, to think, are the books being written today? And maybe some are, but it's possible. There's some great authors writing today, but fantasy authors or science fiction, are they going to be read 60 years from now? Are people going to be having a fiery debates about adaptations of them
exactly.
online, if that's still a thing, on hologram, whatever they're doing in 60 years? And I think a lot of times the answer is no, because there's something perennial and deep and profound that's happening there. So maybe we can kind of get into the next layer of this. Kind of level 2 of talking about the Lord of the Rings is talking about the influences for Tolkien and being able to write it. 'Cause I think those are really important. Maybe they can kind of spill over into as we discuss further. But one of the big ones, as we said, is friendship, and I think that's something that's really key, that comes across beautifully in his books to the point where the friendships that are forged. You think of Sam and Frodo, you think of Gimli and Legolas, like these friendships that happen in their own unique way, Aragorn and Gandalf and all these different characters, that there's a certain beauty to that Tolkien was able to experience in his own life, like that he had friends, and C.S. Lewis being one of them, to the point where C.S. Lewis based one of the main character in his space trilogy on Tolkien. That Ransom is his name. So there's something about that I think is so formative and powerful and comes across beautifully in the books.
Yeah, and I also think that, like, looking at the beauty of Tolkien and like high literature and good literature in general, is it's not them telling a story. And I think this is one of the things that Tolkien captures so well. It's also his exploration, his own personal exploration of various different themes. So a lot of people who have tried to kind of compare his works to kind of allegorical works, even though like Tolkien vehemently despised and hated allegory. Actually, some of his conversations with Lewis was actually where he was in those inkling circles and in that little small group of guys that were meeting at the local, I think it was a pub. But he would actually go after Lewis for writing poor...
Bird and Baby is what they called the pub, but that wasn't the actual name.
But he would go after Lewis because he criticized Lewis quite frequently on the Chronicles of Narnia for being allegorical and being pure allegory because he hated allegory. He despised it. But in the same sense, like you have like these allegorical themes or these motifs that go through the Lord of the Rings, where a lot of people have obviously looked into that and like, well, what's the inspiration for this? Like, what was it? I think it's really important when you're looking at like Tolkien's work to recognize this was also it was kind of his own fictional writings, but it was also his own way of kind of grappling with ideas. And grappling and working through ideas and working through his various different issues. I think that like every filmmaker or modern day, but also writers, like part of like the writing process and the creative process is kind of this own process of working through your own issues, as well as like the deeper questions that you yourself are pondering. One of the great things that I see is and I just got recently really interesting book, which is on the Encyclopedia of Tolkien's, of the things that actually influenced him. It's a new one by, I believe his name is Howard Day. But when you look at that, actually, the influence of Germanic, and like the Germanic mythology, Viking mythology, and which I thought was really fascinating because it's at the same time that he's writing, or just right after the time of this influx of Germanic philosophy and this influx of pagan Germanic philosophy, like during the time of World War II. So like World War II, you had Hitler, who was trying to revitalize this Germanic paganism, Germanic atheistic paganism that was going on at the same time. And so like you do have actually within that period of time, a lot of germophobia,
germophobia.
The phobia of Germans, whatever that's called. But like this hatred of Germans and this hatred of like anything Germanic, especially in connection to Hitler and all this stuff that Hitler had done. At the same time, you'll find a person like Tolkien, highly influenced by Anglo-Saxon, was a professor at Oxford in linguistics and was highly influenced by Anglo-Saxon literature, as he was obviously hearing all the conversations, especially at the high academic circles, of this critique of anything German and this hatred of oftentimes things, as well as you see Hitler, who's trying to popularize this German cult. And then you find Lewis and you find Tolkien, who are writing at the same time. Tolkien, who then uses all these same influences, but uses them in the exact opposite way which Hitler was doing.
Yeah.
Because that's where you'll find like a lot of his, and has a much more beautiful multicultural understanding of the world as well as people. So for instance, like you look at like the Fellowship of the Ring, where you have, as opposed to a white nationalistic fellowship, you have a multicultural fellowship.
And again, he's not doing a straight analogy or something like that.
That's the whole thing. Yeah. Like the elves are not one thing. The dwarves are not one thing, but that's the whole point. The elves and the dwarves both have long ethnic histories of hostility towards each other, right?
Right.
But then yet they're working together at the same time on the Fellowship of the Ring. You have two kind of parallel ideas of masculinity with Aragorn and Boromir. You have like the old king versus like the up and coming one, but then you have the hobbits who kind of like are like children.
Right.
But then you have this all the different ways in which the Fellowship of the Rings, but behind all this is a huge influence, like one of probably the largest influence that Tolkien had, was this taking and trying to create a mythology for England, but using it predominantly and pulling out these beautiful themes that he saw in Anglo-Saxon culture. and that we're being demonized and we're being destroyed, and basically pulling on all these different themes from Nordic mythologies, from Germanic mythologies, and things like that, and showing how these things, although they have pagan roots, there still is a lot of goodness in them.
There's something about that. I think it's a beautiful point that of the unity and diversity, because in a lot of ways, Lord of the Rings is an anti-totalitarian book, even though it culminates with the crowning of a king. That it's anti-totalitarian. It's that king is, because it has abuses of power throughout.
That's one of the major themes.
And so recognizing that power is not bad in and of itself. Which is something I think that we tend towards now as a culture inside. We also recognize that power has been misused oftentimes, and so the result in our society is to despise or tear down or to do away with that, and then to establish our own little systems of power that we're in control of, in academia or whatever it might be. But this recognition of Aragorn as his journey that involves not just like fighting alongside shoulder to sword, but actually fighting for, like there's, it's done beautifully in the movie of the, maybe it's the extended edition of the For Frodo, like we're doing this whole thing, this whole war for the future of all of the entire cosmos. We're doing it all for this one guy. It's that particular and it's that beautiful, which is the opposite of both the communist and the fascist ideologies that were really in vogue at the time that are throughout Europe and still kind of spreading throughout the world today.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, and this is maybe an overplayed one, but the idea of sacrifice, just the willingness of all these people to be fighting together for the good of Middle Earth and for the good of, like you're saying, of the future, and for so many of them to be willing to give up what they claim they want to go back to, but like even with Frodo himself, really never being able to go back home again, to be able to save, all of it, to be able to sacrifice what he has, what he knew, all these guys to sacrifice, the happiness and the simpleness that they had in the Shire, these
hobbits.
These hobbits.
I'm a level 2. He's a level 5.
I was about to say hobgoblins. So yeah, I had to think about it.
You can be an orc.
No.
Hobgoblins.
I may look like an orc, but no. These hobbits, to be willing to sacrifice the simplicity of the Shire, and for them to come back in the Shire really not even really kind of know what went on and what actually happened, that they were willing to move through that and then to bring that richness back to it and enter back into their world, but Frodo not so much, not being able to.
And it's a great not analogy, but corollary, I guess, and greatly influenced by Tolkien's experience of World War I, the Great War, as they called it. Yeah. Like, I don't think any of us, and God bless all of those who are living now who've been through war, but in the history of wars, I mean, World War I has to be up there as far as just the brutality, the horrors that these men experienced.
Well, and it was the first time you had mechanized, systematized means of mass destruction that were started. I mean, obviously you had the nuclear bomb in World War II, but you had the use of gas, chemical warfare. Like, this was the first time that you started seeing terrible, horrible things. The way in which war. I mean, it was the way in which, like, people were traumatized, like coming out of this massive trauma that was coming out of World War I, and then likewise you can say stemmed into, obviously, and dominoed later into World War II. So then the question becomes, like, how do people, not just individuals, but then how do people as a culture kind of deal with the traumas that they're dealing with? And actually, that's one of the beautiful things which I did actually love about Lord of the Rings. And one of the reasons, actually, I can just say, in honesty, why I was drawn towards it. Like, I was drawn to it initially because I liked the fantasy stories when I was a kid, and I saw the terrifying orcs and things like that. But then when I got in my teenage years and my parents got divorced, and I was dealing with my own questions of evil specifically, and that was the thing that for me, I wanted to know, why do these bad things happen? Why are these bad things happening? And why does specifically God allow these bad things to happen? So anything that was one of the reasons why Tolkien for me was an avenue for looking and exploring ideas secondarily, as opposed to looking at them directly. Yeah. But looking at a story where I could explore an idea. And that's where I think that, in my way, maybe this me projecting and reading on the Tolkien, but I don't think it is. I think that Tolkien was doing the same thing. He was exploring ideas through the use of his language and the use of literature to explore questions, which one of the major questions I think in Lord of the Rings he explores is the problem of evil. Like the problem of evil, which actually when Lewis wrote The Problem of Pain, after later his wife died, like he's basically said after Joy died, C.S. Lewis said that like his book on The Problem of Pain was complete garbage. But Tolkien, who like was delving very deeply into like this question.
It's not garbage, by the way. I highly recommend it.
When you're going through that's what Lewis said afterwards. But he said it was insufficient or lacking. But but that's where but Tolkien, as he was delving into the problem of evil, but as opposed to coming up with these short and simple quips or short and simple answers or a short and simple story, I think that's one of the reasons why he was also drawn specifically to Anglo-Saxon literature, because Anglo-Saxon literature, like Beowulf and the ancient lays, the Volsung epic and saga, like these things are tragic. Like that's the thing is like there's dark tragedy in these lays and in these old stories. Like they don't end on a happy note.
Beowulf especially is.
That's what I'm saying. Like they don't end, and if you read,
it's jarring to read it or watch it and just be like, wait, because in a sense, this is pre-Christian, so there's a sense to it that's kind of horrifying.
But realistic.
Yes.
Realistic. But then you have Tolkien, who beautifully blends and takes these old stories and blends them and creates this new story, which has heavy Judeo-Christian Catholic themes that are present throughout it to weave and to explore the question of evil and the problem of evil, but specifically I think in The Lord of the Rings, the problem of how do you fight evil and why do people fail? Like especially like when you look at like Boromir, like in the first like then you parallel and contrast Boromir to Aragorn. Like you have a person who grasps for power and thinks that by grasping for power he's going to do it, and that's what he would have seen in World War I, whether it be in the trenches or whether he was hearing what was going on with the officers and things like that. People who are grasping for powers with the best of intentions, and yet they become corrupt and become corrupted over time. The same way which Saruman, right, the white wizard who's Gandalf's foil, right, Saruman who's grasping for knowledge, which is why he's always dancing. He's always holding the palantir because he thinks that knowledge is going to be salvation, and knowledge will be salvation. Boromir thinks that power will be salvation, military might. You have all these people who are looking for salvation, and therefore, in their pursuit of salvation, they all become exactly that which they hate.
And it's amazing too, because I'm just thinking of those scenes. This is bringing up so many great scenes. Again, he didn't write analogies or metaphors, allegories. But there's so many scenes that perfectly demonstrate that, because the most powerful characters become that way for good, become that way through self-sacrifice.
That's right.
I mean, like that. And in a sense, that's the part of this that becomes totally incomprehensible to the Anglo-Saxon myth. Basically like these stories. The Beowulfs of the world, but in light of Christ. That all of a sudden it takes in all that evil and darkness, but then it does something surprising and shocking and beautiful with it. I think of it years ago. I was visiting my sister and her son Joseph. She had read The Hobbit to him. He was Joseph's in high school now, but she had read The Hobbit to him. He was probably 6, 7 years old, and then she started reading The Lord of the Rings to him too. And Joseph was he loved it. So Kathy, my sister, was the audiobook for it for him. But since I was visiting that night, she's like, "Oh, do you want to read to Joseph before he goes to bed?" Joseph's my godson too, as well as being my nephew. And I was like, "Oh, absolutely." So I go there, and I'm just kind of leaning against the side of the bed, and Joseph's there, and we're at the scene of Khazad-dûm, the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and the mines of Moria. Spoiler for those, it's been out for a long time. It's been out for 70 years.
Yeah, this can't be a spoiler at this point.
But it's where Gandalf, where he fights the Balrog, and basically he's cast down into darkness. He dies so that the rest of the Fellowship can live.
Right.
And I'm reading this scene, and I don't think I'd ever read it out loud before. I've read the books a couple of times through the years, but I'm reading the scene. So the fact, first of all, it's beautifully written. Like it's the man can just write beautifully well to the and that's just it's incredible. It's always, I'm always in awe of that.
If it was just literature, it'd be great.
It's just, but also I'm there with my nephew who's never seen this before. He's never seen the movies. He doesn't know what's going to happen. So he's on the edge of the bed, edge of the seat, like. And so I read that, however, I forget exactly how, he falls into darkness, or however the scene ends or whatever. And Joseph's just like, he died? And like, as I'm reading this, I'm tearing up. Yeah. I'm getting emotional as I'm being drawn into this. And it's like, it'd be really easy to be like, oh, don't worry. Next book, he's going to come back as Gandalf the White, and it's like, because no, he really, like, he takes it seriously. It's not just that like, this happens so that this is almost, it's a very death, like the death of Jesus isn't just some sort of speed bump towards the resurrection. Right. This is the totality of death, of darkness, of the tomb, that he really goes to that place. And so you get this sense of wow, no, he died. It's tragic. And you see the mourning that fills the rest of the fellowship, the hopelessness, the sadness, the self-blame, the blame against the other people, all those things that anyone who's been through a tragic death before knows that. To think of Tolkien must have known that from the inside. To survive World War I means that how many friends did he have that they never even got to mourn, and that they had to keep on moving, and then all those things. So anyone who's been through a trauma like that, to really plumb its depths, and man, it's intense and beautiful, but that it's one of the keys of the whole book becomes that self-sacrifice.
I don't even know if you realize what you just did, but you just said the death of Jesus. Right, I think you meant the death of Gandalf.
Well, yeah, that too.
But that's actually the beautiful thing about the Lord of the Rings, as well as in his Tolkien's writings in general, is that you see these very clear influences where he blends together his Catholic faith. And so, yes, absolutely, like the fall of Gandalf off the bridge of Khazad-dûm as the Balrog, the giant demon, is assaulting, and therefore he sacrifices himself. But you see like this very clear parallel. I mean, you see other points of parallelism within that to like the Anglo-Saxon literature, like whether it be Siegfried or whether it be all these different characters. But this notion of the pursuit, the fall into darkness, the fall into the pits of hell, the fall into like the subterranean lake, which in the second movie was so great, where that's how it opened up. It's like Gandalf like flying down with the sword.
Yes.
Fighting the Balrog, but then it goes up to the heights where he then casts down the Balrog off the mountain tops. But like you find where he took these ancient stories.
I smote his ruin on
the mountainside. Exactly. Yes. But then you also like you see in this, there's something which is different about Tolkien's writings, which is why it's not just an Anglo-Saxon. You can see very clearly the Christological, like where Christ pops up as a motif, kind of back in the back of Tolkien's Catholic mind. Like where he blends in and he shows, no, this is where I can take these ancient stories and I can create something new, blending it with Christianity, and not creating an amalgam, but creating something where you can find that in the ancient pagan world, where they were thirsting for thirsting for salvation. They were thirsting for an answer to the problem of evil.
Amen. Yes.
And this is where like Tolkien shows very clearly, like in all these kind of sideways ways in which Aragorn at times will parallel Christ. Gandalf obviously parallels Christ, but even it's the classic. His who the hero of Lord of the Rings is Samwise.
Yeah,
not Frodo.
right.
Not Frodo. Who, if you parallel Frodo to Sam, it's not the rich noble Frodo, because he is actually a rich noble from a noble house. Right. He's a country gentle lord. Right, that's who Frodo is. Versus his gardener.
Yes,
but it's the gardener. Which I wondered, was he doing that on purpose as a parallel to Adam? Like the gardener, and Jesus shows up in the Garden of Gethsemane as a gardener. It's the gardener, the simple, humble gardener who doesn't want anything other than go back to gardening and going into that. Right. But and that's where there's a drastic difference where in the ancient Viking and Anglo-Saxon and German myths, it's power and glory. It's ultimately this hero who emerges, who's able to either conquer or through his death conquers. But in the Lord of the Rings, it's the humble. It's the humble. It's those who want simple friendship. It's the hobbits. It's the people who are not the highly educated. It's not the intelligentsia. It's not the mighty warriors. The ones who actually do it. It's not the countrified gentleman. It's Frodo's unable to do it.
Yeah.
Right?
It would have been, in a sense, it would have been enough if Frodo, who's already a hobbit, he's already really low compared to the mighty elves and dwarves and men that are waging wars and politicking. Frodo's nothing. But he's like, he's the lord of the nothings, and it's amazing too, because it even brings up, and this is the little way is I think of Saint Therese of Lisieux, is a great doctor of the church, died at 24 years old, probably met 100 people in her entire life. She was in a little Carmelite convent in France, but her theology, her meditation on the scriptures, on the Bible, is so profound and powerful because she focuses on finding the last place, like being small, because then the devil can't even find you if you're small. Only God can find you there, and that's what God does. He makes himself small. So there's something about that too, where the hobbits continue to thwart Sauron's plans because he's so evil and grand. Right. He can't even see them. He can't. He's not gonna even pay attention to these tiny little insignificant nothings. And I think that's something too. We live in Pope Francis calls the culture we're in today. John Paul II called it a culture of death. Pope Francis refers to a throwaway culture. That in a sense that it's so quick to discard other people who aren't useful to us, because if you think of the hobbits, they don't really do much useful things.
No, they eat like 5 breakfasts.
They eat 5 breakfasts.
They get in the way. You're constantly saving them. Exactly.
Smoke pipe weed.
Yeah, you're constantly worried about, are they going to make it?
Yeah. So there's something about that though, that this is, this becomes the driving engine though, that the world is saved by this, and it should always be a challenge to us, and I think it really is beautifully. In Catholic in America, we engage the intersection between faith and culture.
Tune in every week because no topic is out of bounds.
We want to thank you so much for supporting this show by watching it, by liking, sharing, and subscribing. How else can they support the show?
You can also become a patron on Patreon and support us financially.
So if you support us, there's all kinds of swag. There's t-shirts, there's coffee mugs, or maybe bumper stickers. I don't know, maybe we could come up with a wig from Father Tom.
Father Tom wig would go a long way. So thanks for your support. God bless y'all, and check us out next time on Catholic in America.
Hey, welcome back to Catholic in America. We're talking about Lord of the Rings, and Father Tom had something.
Yeah, so I think that just kind of picking up where we last were, but what Tolkien, and I thought especially in the world that we live in today, where many people are struggling with the problem of evil. We're all very familiar. That's one of the major things, especially young people who are walking away from the faith, walking away from their belief in God, or even questioning the belief of God because of this question of evil and why does God allow bad things to happen. That's why I find, and especially in like I said, in my youth, I found Tolkien to be so helpful, not necessarily definitively answering that question, but giving a story where we're able to ponder some of those deeper questions, especially dealing with tragedy. Like anyone who has dealt with tragedy, anyone who has dealt with, whether it's the tragedy of death, whether it's trauma, whether it's various different bad things, and that's the whole thing. That's one of the things like in the Lord of the Rings, which they actually cut out of the movies, which was the scourging of the Shire.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Because that's the whole point in the books is the hobbits go home and they then find out that their homes have been ravaged and have been destroyed.
Right.
Which, just think about Tolkien coming back from World War I and then ultimately him seeing people coming back from World War II and the trauma of people coming back and traumatized. And we went out, we fought a good fight, and now people are coming back. And then there's this question of how do we deal with the lingering effects of evil, and how do you deal with the lingering effects of trauma? And that's why the beauty of the Lord of the Rings is that the Lord of the Rings grapples, and Tolkien through his writing and through, I think, processing his own, what he himself was seeing, not just in one area of life where it's an allegory, but processing life in general and saying that no, despite these things that have all happened, there still is light. And the light is friendship, obviously a major theme of the book, but the light is also this notion of hope. Is yes, Frodo comes back, and actually Frodo can't stay in the Shire because he's too traumatized. Just like many guys came back from war, and they weren't the same as when they went to war, and then they come back from war and they're not the same. But there's this notion of hope, which he breeds, which he weaves throughout the book, which is, I still think, is a telling. I think it's also one of the reasons why The Lord of the Rings is a timeless work, because it deals not with something. If it was just a direct allegory to World War II, there's eventually going to be a point where World War II I mean, I don't think we'll ever forget it. It will always remember it, but there still is a point where World War II is going to eventually fade, but the issues, the human issues that Tolkien grapples with in a very deep way are just as prevalent and just as relevant today as they were when he was writing 70 years ago.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So we're going to go ahead and give an official Catholic in America recommendation. So
for the Rings of Power?
No, I did not say that. I did not say that. Rings of Power is a different story altogether. But no, I can't recommend Lord of the Rings highly enough. I think it's beautiful, and also too, I just recommend people to write, to seek ways of being creative, seek ways of not because you're going to make money off of it or anything like that. Just to write, to create art. That the world needs that, and the world needs beautiful things. And I know how much it's benefited me that people have done the hard work of doing that. So I think that's just a good note for us to encourage each other on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us for Catholic in America. We're so glad that you were here with us. If you're a supporter of our show, thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to support our show, please look us up on Patreon so that you can be a part of that. Anything that you would give is worth it to us. So please do be a part of that. And of course, we always covet your prayers. So until next time, God bless.